got a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now. Okay, so we have an apparent serious oxygen leak. 4, 3, 2, 1. Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it. Performing an evasive maneuver. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
Welcome to space.
Hello, welcome to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast, where we take you through all the mistakes, failures, and explosions that made modern space exploration possible. I'm Chris.
I'm Quinn.
And I'm caffeinated, Chris.
And we are your hosts. Fuck.
Should I have said we are your hosts?
Wait, did you say we are your hosts?
No, I did not, but I was going to say, should I have said that?
No, I think that works. I just said fuck because I realized that like instantly after this, I have, and we are your hosts. And today we're kicking off. I have like and repeated in a weird way. But we still have the, and I'll just change it to so. It just flowed weird.
You could just say today. You don't even have to say and today.
Yeah.
And we are your hosts today.
And we, your
right?
faithful hosts, will be covering.
It would be funny, better if we just said we are your hosts today. And then just left that hang as though someday soon. We're just like, they're just going to tune in and just hear Matt and no one else.
Matt's going to be running the show today. Quinn and Chris Square have vanished in a tragic rocket explosion accident.
We were doing some on-the-ground journalism, testing to see how flammable this fuel really is.
We were testing. We were doing some on-the-ground journalism, documenting the experiences of 21st century mad scientist who's trying to make rocket mail happen again.
We were the two children he killed.
We're off in the Donbass looking for Rogozin's lost testicle.
Oh, God. That will be the Real Monsters series, is talking like that. That has to be the first dude on that list, is talking about Dmitry Rogozin.
No, it has to split up Rogozin and his testicle.
Well, in fairness, it was his ass that got shelled, and then he sent a piece of his ass to Emmanuel Macron as like an own.
I thought he got his cock knocked in Donbass.
No, that was kind of like rumors and lies. He got his ass blasted.
That's just...
We are a historical podcast. We deal only in facts. Dmitry Rogozin's ass got blasted.
This to me, it's similar to the whole like he was burning up in re-entry and swearing at the Soviet Union the whole way down. You know, like,
oh yeah, the Komarov stuff. Conspiracies spread, especially whenever it's like stuff that you want to believe. And Rogozin getting his dick blown off is funnier, so it has legs.
Rogozin, the dick with legs.
Oh, God. We will talk about him, audience. We will talk about Dmitry Rogozin, and his fucking. What we need to do as well is go back and check in on the Roscosmos mercenary squad and see how if they've died yet. I haven't heard much about them since.
Bye-bye, guys.
That's. You're gonna do like the most meaningful work of your life. You're gonna go die in a trench. Fuck. But audience, forget all of that for now, because we are not talking about someone who dies in a trench. We are talking about an asshole.
Ooh.
We are going to start off 2024 strong with, the second part of a series from 2023.
Remember when we did that thing in 23?
Remember whenever we did that thing that all of you messaged me and said made you actually like physically sad? Or like ruined your days at work? We're continuing that series. We're making Forgotten Cosmonauts an actual series. It might not be all sequential, but like on doing homework for this episode, it turns out the Soviet space program wrote like a lot more dudes out of history.
Of course.
As the Soviets are wont to do.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about all of them. But first, we do have a little bit of news to go over. First off, 2024 is going to be the year of YouTube, by which we mean we're going to work through the entire massive backlog that we were supposed to have worked through in 2023. Promise this time, pinky swearsies. A lot of the stuff we have talked about goes great with visuals. We do have all of that in the pipe on the way. Eventually, we're hoping to have these come out as the episodes do, but for now, we're going to focus on getting the big backlog of videos. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to the YouTube, check out some of the videos on there, and those will keep coming out in the future. Other big news, we have decided to start a Patreon. So if you want to support the show, help us buy research materials and, the hosting websites for this show, you will find a link in the description. We are still sorting things out as far as tiers, but if you subscribe right now at the $3 a month tier or higher, you will be getting one bonus episode a month. As you are listening to this episode, you can subscribe and get access to our first bonus, a review of the classic Soviet sci-fi film Planet of the Storms, and we have a lot more coming. Also, there are, because we recorded it recently, there may be some inside jokes from that episode that wake their way in. You will not understand them if you are not a Patreon subscriber. Subscribe to the Patreon for understanding our jokes.
Pay for comprehension.
Exactly. If we make a joke and you don't find it funny, that's because there's actually a hidden layer of paid humor underneath it. And if you are a Patreon subscriber, you are financially obligated to laugh at whatever we say. You've already bought in, why bother not laughing?
It's sunk cost fallacy of humor.
Exactly. You have paid for the funny podcast, therefore the podcast is funny.
I paid $80 for this game. I'm going to enjoy every last hour of its content.
Exactly. So if you have ever found yourself on the fence about our podcast and wishing it was funnier or more informative or whatnot, pay money and then it will suddenly be funnier and more informative. Your brain will your neuroplasticity will make that happen for you. But, jokes aside, if anyone does want to, feel free, link in the description. It would go a long way towards supporting us. But for today, for the free episode, we're going to be continuing our story of the Forgotten Cosmonauts. So last time, I'm sure you guys remember, I got fans telling me it made them sick to their stomach. It made them sad. We talked about Valentin Bondarenko, one of the first 20 cosmonauts, and his tragic death in an oxygen fire just a few weeks before Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space.
If it made you sad listening, know that I was there at Ground Zero when Quinn released the information the first time.
I have no shame in saying I was crying when I wrote parts of that episode, especially the part where his wife and Roger Chaffee's dad are getting together. I might be getting my Chaffees mixed up. But, that hurt me. A lot of the times I have fun inflicting these bad stories on my friends and audience.
This was a mutual. Everyone. This was past a line.
This is one that I will enjoy inflicting on all of you people. This one is a lot less bleak. We're going to talk about Grigory Nelyubov, the guy who got written out of history for being too much of a dick.
Yes, we're back in the fold.
A guy who was such an asshole, he got 2 other cosmonauts erased by association alone.
Wait, you're saying this man had an AoE?
They AoE censored him. They collateral damaged 2 other dudes to censor this dude.
Christ, I'm buddy.
Yeah, I mean, we'll explore why. Kind of makes a weird kind of sense. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but I have to wonder. There's this great story from James Oberg, space journalist, and he's one of the first guys who really researches and finds out through all these different photos that hey, cosmonauts are getting written out of history. There's this great story where he's talking to a new batch of NASA astronauts, and he's showing them these pictures to kind of show hey, this is what used to happen over in the Soviet Union. Just this same picture of dudes gradually disappearing from a group photo. And all of the astronauts immediately agreed that their way of countering that would just be every group photo, they would play Twister. They would have to lock their arms in weird and complicated ways. They would just be hugging each other. So there's no way you can cut us out.
There's no way. Yeah. The rules.
And I have to wonder if that's how some people got written out of history. If you just hugged someone for a photo and they got written out, if the censor was just too much work. You're both gone.
We don't pay the airbrush artist enough. Get rid of them.
We're not rendering in a new person for you to hug. You're also just gone.
Just badly change the face to the janitor.
It's Yuri Gagarin in the Poseidon suit.
Imagine if it was there was just the guy, and I mean this in the most nondescript sense. It's just, you are the censor artist who has to airbrush people out of photos, and then you pull out the guy.
Oh, just the one default dude?
Yeah, default dude replaces it. It's who is he? Who is Sandy Loam?
Becoming a Soviet stock photo model, and 2 weeks later, you find out that you're a cosmonaut, technically, because they put your face in the photo.
A week later, he's a doctor. And a week after that, he's an airplane pilot.
Beautiful.
Yeah, Soviet John Doe is just every single photo. It would just be like those memes of the entire family photo with one dude on every face. Is the entire Nelyubov family is just stock models now.
Love it.
Grigory's early life.
When Nelyubov was born, he was born a full-grown baby. That's to say, he was like he had the body of a baby, but the face of a man.
Already wearing his trademark sneer.
I wonder if is looking nondescript in the Soviet Union, is that a superpower or a detriment? You know? That you can just disappear into any photo, but you can also be censored so easily.
I think it's the fact you can blend in anywhere. You can just say, no, that's not me.
Yeah.
Oh, but then the Soviets really don't. They'll just censor me anyway.
Now, for all that you joke, we basically have no info on his childhood. It really starts whenever he's just a teenager, so he may as well have just been born fully grown.
Was he decanted from a tube by the NKVD?
No, so this is actually like with Bondarenko. Most of this is intentional, and it is a testament to how effective the erasure of his life was.
Oh.
So we don't know a lot about his childhood. What little we do know is often contradictory. So, for example, his records say he was born on April 9th, 1934, but his tombstone in Zaporizhia says he was born on March 31st. Regardless, Grigory Grigoryevich Nelyubov was born in Crimea. So his father, Grigory, was a captain in the NKVD, and this is the World War II era precursor to the KGB, while his mother, Daria, was a housewife. Unfortunately, I've got even less to say about his childhood than I did about Bondarenko. He, like a lot of first cosmonauts, likely lived under Nazi occupation during World War II until Crimea was liberated in 1944, although it's also possible his family fled the Nazi advance. We really don't know.
Either way, the information is basically lost.
Or if it is, it's in Russian and I can't access it.
There's something like both foreboding and ironic, the fact that the man that you're about to tell me about that's been erased from history had a father who was in the NKVD.
Like the dude who would have instantly just like, Dad, they erased me from history, and he just nods. Yep.
Sounds right.
I don't have a son. So, also like the other cosmonauts, Nelyubov grew up idolizing pilots. So in 1953, we fast forward a little bit, while still in school, he signed up for the Zaporizhia Aero Club, graduating less than a year later with more than 50 flight hours in a trainer. Once he graduated secondary school, he enrolled at the Stalin Naval Aviation School number 12 in Russia. So fun fact, that school is still around today, and it's now named after fellow cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov.
Oh, dang.
Yeah. So Nelyubov graduated in 1957 as a naval aviator with the rank of lieutenant. And I didn't mention it before, but I just love the Soviet thing of just naming, I guess communist thing more, of naming schools just with numbers.
Stalin School number 382 reporting in.
Now, once he's a pilot, Nelyubov spent the next few years at various squadrons all around Crimea, eventually earning a privileged spot at the 966th Fighter Regiment, flying the new MiG-19, the hottest jet the Soviets had. He also quickly rose through the ranks, making a name for himself as an amazing pilot and athlete. So when the Cosmonaut selection contest started in 1959, Nelyubov passed with ease, becoming one of the first 20. Also, at some point during his selection, he met and married Zinaida Kostina, a professional skydiver. And this is one funny thing about cosmonaut wives, is that they basically all fall into two categories. They're either housewives or they're daredevil professionals. So like a load of them are skydivers. Marina Popovich, wife of Pavel Popovich, was like the top female test pilot in the world.
I like the thought of what would become of the Popovich children. My mom, she's a test pilot. My dad, he's a cosmonaut. Me, I'm a business major.
Ward of the State. Oh God, that
has a powerful.
That's got to be some expectations. Although, I mean, looking at the Gagarin family, maintaining Yuri Gagarin's cult basically became his entire family's full-time job. Like his daughter is in charge of the Gagarin Museum, or like the Space Museum in Moscow, and her job is lying about her father's life.
Ooh.
Yeah. Anyway, Grigory and Zinaida are sent off to the new Star City facility outside Moscow, the headquarters of the Soviet manned space program, and where the cosmonauts will live and train. And this is something I wanted to talk about before, just how ridiculously slapdash the initial cosmonaut training was. You'd think that after being selected to be like the first men in space, these guys would get the most high-tech training, like the Soviet montage from Rocky. But Korolev had put the entire program together in such a rush that they picked the pilots first and figured everything else out later. While Yuri Gagarin would eventually make sure that every cosmonaut got the gay luxury space communism they'd all been promised, the first cosmonauts lived in an active construction zone that had eventually become the Star City Gym.
This is just the cosmonaut version of Fire Festival.
It is. It literally is. Like you've been duped. You think you're going to go to space and then they drop you off in the gym.
You're top of the line flat. No, you're going to have to listen to someone's song away for 12 hours a day.
I'll give you an example. Alexei Leonov described where he and his wife first lived like this.
Bunk beds in the corner of a volleyball court. We had to trade newspapers over the net to get some privacy because another pilot and his wife were sleeping at the other end of the court.
I love that. This is the guy who will perform the first spacewalk in history.
And they're living in like a tent in a basketball court.
They do not even merit an entire volleyball court.
No, you have to share it.
Why did I say basketball? You already prefaced that it was a volleyball court.
Oh, well, the cosmonauts all loved basketball, too. I'm sure some of them were sleeping in the basketball court.
I've been programmed by the American gymnasium.
Oh, no, my big question is, was the court still used even while they're sleeping on it? You know, just during the day,
they were all
court.
athletes. I wonder if this was like some Stockholm syndrome stuff. Like if they get in, they immediately force them to sleep in the capsule so they acclimate to it and, you know, start to associate with it as home.
Stay with the sports. I was immersed in the volleyball.
They're living the dream, honestly. I want to be like a lab rat. I want to live in the facility, quote. The facility trademark, and I want to be fed cheese. I want to be fed goop, nutritional goop, and I need to be rewarded for doing the tasks.
On the side of the volleyball court, there's a little chute and a red button, and every time Alexei Leonov presses the button, like a little banana pellet comes out.
And pre-workout.
That's how Alexei Leonov's living. For his part, cosmonaut German Titov described it like this.
We may as well have moved into a training camp for the Olympics.
So Star City is nowhere near completed. These guys are just shoved in and they start training like before it's even done. And like I said, Yuri Gagarin would turn this entire thing on its head. Cosmonauts later on would have like massive 6-room apartments and they would have a dedicated party lounge, all designed by Gagarin himself. So once training actually started in earnest, Nelyubov quickly made a name for himself as a standout cosmonaut candidate. He was a great pilot, a solid athlete, and he had a knack for being the center of every important conversation. His fellow trainees almost all describe him as being technically brilliant and having a level of self-confidence that bordered on extreme arrogance. And you might be starting to see some red flags here.
Ah, yes, the sense of self-importance. Rising.
One of the funny ways I've seen this described is he had all of Gagarin's like charisma, love of partying, and arrogance, but just taken to 11. Like someone who makes Gagarin seem humble.
Damn, this guy, he's too good. We can't keep him. He'll outshine all the others.
We're gonna see this because like he is technically skilled, like in technical skills, he is one of the best cosmonauts out there. And we talked about this briefly in the Bondarenko episode, but out of the initial 20 cosmonauts, Korolev had a group of favorites that he nicknamed the Vanguard 6. So these were the standouts. These were the guys who were expected to fly on the earliest Vostok missions, and they were specially trained for it.
And mind you, nothing to do with the American Vanguard. This isn't a joke about American Vanguard by the Soviets or anything.
If anything, that's like bad luck to name your thing after the weird failed American rocket. No, but these guys are the Vanguard as in like the tip of the spear. They're going to be the ones to punch through to space. And again, like these guys get special training. They get special treatment in terms of, and even just like in terms of how the staff treat them, they are a tier above. They are a special class of cosmonaut.
Their soup was actually hot.
They don't live in any volleyball courts. We have half a basketball court.
They live on the ice rink.
Everybody else just like looking at the basketball court and like the floor does the sheen, like sparkle noise. Now, despite all of his skills, Nelyubov was not initially part of the Vanguard 6. Instead, it took another man failing to give Grigory his spot. So Anatoly Kardashev was one of the most promising cosmonaut candidates, someone who had a real shot of being launched first. But during centrifuge training, he was found out to have fragile veins. Basically, what happened is when they got him out of the centrifuge, he felt fine, he looked fine, but his entire back was blood red with internal bleeding.
Ooh.
Yeah. This problem was worrying enough that Kardashev was immediately removed from the Vanguard 6. He went back to basic cosmonaut training for a few months until the doctors dismissed him from the cosmonaut team entirely. And for what it's worth, Kardashev later went on to become one of the Soviet Union's best test pilots, and the weak veins thing never stopped him in the slightest. So he very easily could have just continued being a cosmonaut.
Wow, that is... Ooh.
Yeah, presumably just like bleeding into his seat the entire time.
I is slowly.
Well, you said it was internal bleeding.
But what do you mean? The blood is supposed to be on the inside. He's good.
So this is incredibly bad news for Kardashev, but it's very good news for Nelyubov because he's given Kardashev's spot. And what's weird is even though he wasn't in the Vanguard 6, and even though he is a latecomer to the group, he immediately sets himself up as being one of the best candidates of the entire bunch. So like he gets into the Vanguard 6 and he's immediately like top of the pack. I don't know why he wasn't in it in the first place, although there is a good case to be made that like just his interpersonal dogshitness holds him back.
He may have had, the riz of Gagarin, but sometimes stack overflow happens and it just horseshoes into horrible.
And again, in technical skills, he is literally one of the best cosmonauts, like possibly even the best. So this is also where we see some of his bad traits. Even in a team full of self-confident hotshots, Nelyubov stood out for being intensely egotistical, always wanting to be the center of attention, and for making it very clear that he viewed the training as a competition and his fellow cosmonauts were his opponents. This mixed perfectly with a massive superiority complex and an inability to ever be wrong. How to put this? You've got the asshole end of the right stuff, Like we talked about with the Bondarenko episode, it's very possible for someone to have the right stuff and still be like a cool dude. But the right stuff can also make someone in like an insane egotistical dick, which is Nelyubov.
I mean, it ultimately makes sense because that teamwork facet of it is so...
Oh, yeah.
That sounds like that is the linchpin between you're going to get put in the Nelyubov box or the Bondarenko box. Can you function in a group?
And at the same time, I can understand kind of putting him in the Vostok program more than any other, because to give you an example, like the other cosmonauts who weren't in the Vanguard 6, they weren't necessarily worse. They were not like being relegated to the lower leagues or something. They were getting ready for manned, like multi-crew missions in Voskhod and Soyuz spacecraft. They were picked because they were more team players. Nelyubov was not a team player, so he got picked for the one-man spacecraft, which kind of makes sense.
Oh, it makes it perfect sense.
This man is getting sent back to the volleyball court with a note pinned on his shirt.
Oh, we're going to erase you and send you to the volleyball court of the damned.
The volleyball court of the damned.
Limbo is just an infinitely large volleyball court with like 12 cosmonauts wandering around it.
And no net.
No net, no newspaper, no privacy.
Stare upon your fellow shame.
Now, I don't really want to psychoanalyze a dude 60 years later, but Nelyubov's fellow cosmonauts describe him as being a very cool guy as long as you weren't either in his way or competing with him. As the launch date to Vostok 1 got closer and the Vanguard 6 was narrowed down to just the top 3 candidates, Yuri Gagarin, German Titov, and Grigory Nelyubov, his more asshole-ish tendencies started to take hold. For example, in December 1960, during a meeting with Gagarin and Titov, he went on a rant complaining about how tough his training was and how unfair the standards placed on him were. Like attention-seeking, woe-is-me stuff. Understandably, Titov lost his temper and told him to fuck off because they were all doing the exact same training with the same standards. Nelyubov was not special or oppressed.
Despite being the most gifted, wow, why is this so hard on me? You dick, we are in the same program. We are in the mix.
It's also this kind of thing where, like, if he's competing with people, he's like, fuck you, I'm going to win. And then every now and then he'll also go back to these same people, Gagarin and Titov, and just go like, hey, do you guys think they're being unfair to me?
Can you validate my own views on this matter?
Exactly. Like, man, you guys have it so easy.
They must really like you. Huh, I wonder why. We're just climbing higher. I cannot wait for the fall.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll come and it'll be hilarious. Don't worry. So when it came time to pick the first man to fly into space, the decision was not entirely Korolev's. It came down to a committee of space program officials, each with their own favorite candidate. It's also worth mentioning that while there was a lot of debate among the officials, every cosmonaut apparently agreed that Gagarin was the easy pick. Though this might just be hindsight and lying for the sake of Gagarin's images. Like, this is what they say in their memoirs 30 years down the line.
Oh, this is flat out lying. We're talking about a man who's done nothing but try to inflate his own image. is saying, no, Gagarin was the better pick. I refuse to believe.
Well, it's also that like dudes who like German Titov, when Gagarin does eventually get picked, Titov is like devastated. And then in his memoirs will write about how like, well, of course, Gagarin, maybe that was wisdom. I do genuinely think Gagarin was the best pick of those three, but like it might have been him being wise, or it might have been like, well, I better lie to help the Gagarin legend. So in all these debates and reports between officials, they basically lay out the pros and cons of each cosmonaut like this. So first off, Gagarin was viewed as the most personable and easiest to work with, the best at handling problems and failures. He had a bit of an egotistical streak, but it wasn't unmanageable. He also had the benefit of Korolev liking him personally, even telling other officials, I like that brat.
He was Korolev's boy.
Yeah, exactly. To a certain degree, everyone in the Vanguard 6 was. Like, you didn't make it to the Vanguard 6 if Korolev didn't like you to one degree or another, but Gagarin, like legends aside, Gagarin is kind of legitimately Korolev's favorite. German Titov was valued for his straightforwardness. It sometimes made him brusque and a little hard to work with, but it meant that he'd never find excuses and would always put the task before any of his personal wants. So he's very like, he does the job, he gets shit done. The downside is that he was also impulsive and not good at handling failures. He would often get pissed and like lose his temper if he had to try a task again and again. This also made him way less popular than Gagarin as a propaganda figure. He couldn't do speeches good, and whenever he did go on tours, he never learned to let down the Cold War hatred when talking to Westerners. So there's all kinds of examples of like press conferences with him next to a NASA astronaut, and they're just kind of like bickering the entire time, where Gagarin would be much more like, hey, like I've been to space, you've been to space, we're basically brothers.
Space brothers. Yeah. Instead with Titov, it's just the constant no.
Titov could not let go of ideology.
Oh, for what it's worth, and I have been meaning to tell this story for a while. My grandfather wound up meeting a few of the cosmonauts because he served as a Canadian Air Force liaison at the Soviet embassy around this time in like the 60s. And from what he said, Gagarin, like it kind of corroborates what we know. Like Gagarin being the much more like personable face, the guy who could put aside differences and just be fun at a party, where German Titov was more of just a dick and just like, no, you're on the other side from me. We're not talking.
Oh boy.
And finally, we get to Nelyubov. So Grigory was viewed as the most technically skilled of all three, but also had the most complex personality. He had Gagarin's egotism, charisma, and love for partying all turned up to 11, which is basically to a problematic amount. Also, officials got the sense that he cared more about his own achievements and fame than the program. So he's a fucking glory hound who is unfortunately the best at his job.
A little bit of a narcissist, it seems.
A little bit.
So the selection was not made until a week before the flight. Up to this point, all of them are like training on the assumption that they could be sent. In mid-March 1961, all 6 Vanguard cosmonauts were flown out to Baikonur, Kazakhstan for final tests and to watch the last test flight Vostok, carrying Chernushka the dog and Ivan Ivanovich the crash test dummy. Eventually, Gagarin was picked as first to fly. Titov would be his backup for Vostok 1, while Nelyubov would be second backup. The first time they delivered the news, it was just to Gagarin and Titov in an office, but someone actually decided that it needed to be filmed for posterity, so they recreated the scene. So there's a famous like gazebo in Baikonur just outside the launch site, and they had a big official meeting there with Gagarin, Titov, and Nelyubov, and it was all filmed. However, because of camera problems, they had to reshoot it several times. So you can find footage of Gagarin giving a little speech about how he's honored to accept the mission, and in all of these shots, Titov and Nelyubov are just looking more and more pissed as they're having to act this out over and over and over.
Basically having it rubbed in their face for hours.
Yeah, it's like if you got the bronze. Well, it's not even getting the bronze. It's coming last. So like Nelyubov, this extreme egotist, is forced to go through losing over and over on camera.
Oh, this is his own little personal hell for a couple hours.
Yeah.
I love the idea that they're just in the desert and there's just a gazebo.
No, like you can find pictures. It's just a gazebo. It's just there's a little table.
It's a hike away from the launch site facility. There's just a gazebo.
It's fully something like if you were lost in the desert and you saw it, you would dismiss it as a mirage. You would keep going. It's incredibly out of place. Now, Nelyubov never got to fly. Later, for Vostok 2, he was Titov's backup, and the way this was supposed to work was there was supposed to be like a treadmill of second backup to pilot, So he was supposed to be the pilot of Vostok 3, but he got bumped. So part of this reason comes down to quotas. So despite being from Ukraine, Nelyubov was ethnically Russian. And since Gagarin and Titov were both Russian, the Kremlin wanted to do some token representation for other parts of the Soviet Union. You know, they didn't want it to be just like, even though the space program was incredibly favorable towards Russians, they wanted to, you know, get some other people in there. So Nikolaev, the cosmonaut who flew on Vostok 3, was Chuvash, while Pavel Popovich on Vostok 4 was Ukrainian. So he gets bumped from both of those. Nelyubov thought he was going to fly on Vostok 5, but he gets bumped by Valery Bykovsky, and he wasn't even assigned as a backup that time.
Oh, his fifis are getting hurt.
Oh, yeah. Around the same time, he gets bumped from Vostok 6 too, this time for a barely trained Valentina Tereshkova, which hurts his ego even more because someone would like, well, not just a woman, the fact that Valentina Tereshkova has no qualifications for this, where like she is picked and put through an incredibly quick crash course. She's not a pilot. We will talk about this at some point, and I'm not predisposed to like Valentina Tereshkova because she's currently one of like the biggest pieces of shit in Russia's government. She's one of the main writers of all of the anti-gay and LGBTQ bills they push. She is a fucking monster. But even then, whenever she flies, she is not a trained cosmonaut. It would wait until like Svetlana Savitskaya, who flies a few years later, is the first trained, like, qualified woman in space.
I was I was cycling through like a whirlpool of ideas here.
Oh no.
Nelyubov woke. Nelyubov LGBT
right, we can work
ally.
With this. And that's why Valentina Tereshkova went down that road. Honestly, I feel like you kind of hit the nail on the head with the first one. If anything's going to stick, it would be Nelyubov woke, or Nelyubov. Oh, hold on. What if we've kind of been a left-wing podcast. We've kind of been on that tip in those communities. What if we pivoted to the right and we just said Grigory Nelyubov was canceled by the Soviet Union? He got bumped because of like minority representation, and then he got bumped because of a woman.
Who had no qualifications to take his spot. God. And she was the diversity hire.
He was bumped for being a free speech warrior.
The thing that sucks is that is partially kind of true, that at a certain point the Soviet Union did just go like,
and that is
all right,
why
now
communism
we need to
bad.
Like at a certain point they did just start ticking first boxes. Like Valentina they could have launched actually trained female cosmonauts, Marina Popovich, Svetlana Savitskaya. But Valentina Tereshkova had the proletarian, like she was a farm girl. She had a bit of skydiving experience. And that's what you needed. That's Vostok 6 right there. And again, I can be mad at her because she is like literally one of the biggest pieces of shit in Russia right now. And at the same time, Svetlana Savitskaya is also a massive piece of shit. She's in the Duma and she's like one of the most hardline. She's in the Communist Party, but she's incredibly pro-Putin. For basically everything.
Pro-Putin.
Sue me. Nelyubov was the only Vanguard 6 cosmonaut not to fly on a Vostok mission. Now, we don't exactly know why he got bumped. Like, among other things, he gets bumped from Vostok 5, and there's no given reason for that. He just gets replaced with Bykovsky, and Bykovsky is actually just a much cooler dude. What we do know is that the head of cosmonaut training, Nikolai Kamanin, who I have my own problems with, had a lot of power over cosmonaut selection, and he hated Nelyubov on a personal level.
Oh, beautiful.
This is part of what we talked about before we were recording, where like Kamanin has this idea in his head that cosmonauts should be professional and they should actually be role models. And then he looks at what the cosmonauts are actually doing and he fucking hates them because they're partying. They're like puking in the Star City pool. They're constantly getting in trouble, and like local businesses are calling him up like, just like, hey, some cosmonauts beat up a bunch of kids in town. What do I do? And of those cosmonauts who misbehaved, Nelyubov was like the tip of the spear. He was the Vanguard. He was in the Vanguard 6 of like being a drunken moron. So because of all of this, by 1963, so this goes on over the course of like basically 3 years, when it was clear he wouldn't be picked for the last Vostok missions, Nelyubov was a very angry man, and the rejections only fed his massive persecution complex. So, in March 1963, Nelyubov went out drinking with a few of his cosmonaut buddies, Ivan Anikiev and Valentin Filatiev. This was not uncommon. Most of the cosmonauts were hard-partying young men who liked to drink and have fun. Because Gagarin was put in charge of Star City after his flight, most of the partying actually took place at the training center. So Gagarin had, like, they called it the insertion as a nickname, as a double entendre. Yes. So they had their 2 apartment buildings, and the insertion was a dedicated party zone that connected their 2 apartment buildings. So people wouldn't have to go out into the cold to go between them. And also so that they could just hold massive ragers there.
Where are you going tonight? The insertion.
The insertion. So yeah, they had that on base, but it still wasn't uncommon for cosmonauts to sneak out at night to hit up local bars. And this is what we talked about, where like Kamayanin has to deal with all of these local towns calling him up like, hey, a cosmonaut just smashed my car. Hey, a cosmonaut stole my cat.
The cosmonauts have breached containment.
It fully is. Yeah, these guys are just like the dumbest motherfuckers on the planet whenever they're drunk and loose. So they have to stay in Star City.
They must be contained.
Hey, bro, I was gonna pick up some babes over at the insertion later. You down?
I got my mission, dude. Fuck. You got to back up, man. Just
skip out, bro.
You're not gonna launch without you. All right, now I'm gonna look this up. Star City insertion building.
Like the thing.
I found it
without looking. When you say that to me, I am just imagining like one of those enclosed sky bridges between 2 buildings.
It's like that, but it's on the ground floor, and it has like a little atrium off to the side where people just like party, yeah, or have sex, as it turns out.
Why is this the thing that sends us?
Well, just because, like, yeah, Yuri Gagarin and Kamayanin are the 2 opposite ends of like the cosmonaut respectability spectrum, and they both wind up in charge of Star City, sharing the job. So like, there's this constant tension because Gagarin is literally having construction workers build dedicated cosmonaut like debauchery zones. And Kamayanin is desperately trying to wrangle these idiots who keep breaking into nearby towns. Kamayanin is not a good guy. I will remind Pete, like, there is not a good guy directly in that story. Like, Kamayanin is the guy who orders the cover-ups of cosmonaut deaths. He's the guy who keeps Bondarenko's death from all the other cosmonauts. Anyway, we were talking about, like, containment being breached, these cosmonauts getting all over the place. We have 3 of them loose. We have Nelyubov, Anikayev, and Filatiev. And for them, getting loose means getting shit-faced in a small restaurant at the Chalovsky railway station, which is like a few miles walk from Star City. It's also worth mentioning that according to Alexei Leonov, because of earlier party-related incidents, this restaurant had complained to Star City and specifically asked them to keep the cosmonauts away.
Ooh.
Yeah, like, do not let them come back. Like, no entry if you have a Hero of the Soviet Union medal.
You're too cool for this establishment.
Yeah, we don't want you. And clearly that did not stop Nelyubov. So here's a quote from that book, The First Cosmonaut Team. Soon the 3 men had brought attention to themselves by their boisterous behavior as they engaged in a ribald arm wrestling competition. Ribald, I don't know. Twice, laughing and joking out loud, they had knocked glasses filled with beer onto the floor of the restaurant, by which time the bar owner decided it was time to call in the authorities and have the men asked to move along. At this, the cosmonauts decided it was time to leave and made their way out onto the platform, ready to call it a night. So, nothing crazy too far. They get successfully kicked out of the bar. They started making their way down the platform and back toward the training center, but remember, like, the bar owner had called the authorities, so they quickly ran into a small military patrol. The soldiers just told them to quiet down a bit and ask to see their ID. So, first problem, none of the cosmonauts had brought their IDs, so they can't even prove that they are cosmonauts. That is when Nelyubov started shoving the soldiers, drunkenly shouting that he was a cosmonaut and that he deserved more respect. God damn it.
Oh, no.
He tried to walk past the soldiers, which dragged all of them, including Anikayev and Filatiev, into a quick brawl that the cosmonauts lost badly. So all 3 got arrested as the patrol officer phoned Star City to figure out just who the hell they were. He wound up talking to the training center's commissar, who was furious at the cosmonauts, but asked the dude to let them go because they're cosmonauts. They're untouchable.
Can you just send these idiots on their way? Thanks.
Exactly. Like, dude, please, like, I'm so sorry. It's like if your dog bites someone or like gets mad at someone, you're just like, I'm so sorry. I swear I'll train him better. It is also worth mentioning that at no point in this story has Nelyubov stopped shouting.
He's just constantly loud.
At no point in this incident, as he is like arrested and fucking held by these soldiers, he does not moderate his behavior at all. He keeps giving them shit. And the patrol commander, the officer in charge here, was being very reasonable with these dudes. He told Nelyubov that like he didn't give a shit that he was a cosmonaut, but the three dudes are still soldiers, and he respects that. And he lays out a condition. If Nelyubov will just apologize to the kid he punched, because these are just like teenage conscripts, the commander will let them go. He'll forget everything, and there won't be a report.
Nelyubov can't do this.
He cannot be wrong. So Anikiev and Filatiev, they agree on the spot and they apologize. Done. Nelyubov arrogantly shouted that he has friends in high places, and if a report did get written, they would be very unhappy with the officer. And it didn't work. Quote from the first cosmonaut team. Initially prepared to forgive a relatively harmless drunken episode, the officer now insisted that a full apology was in order from Nelyubov. Before releasing the three men, the officer said that a suitable apology would have to be made before 2 p.m. the following afternoon, or the matter would go much further. So even at this point, he's being like very reasonable. He's just saying like, dude, apologize. You punched that kid.
He's just sitting there, just like pinching his nose. Just, can you apologize?
I didn't say it before, but the officer is also like, yo, you're cosmonauts. Can you like sign some autographs? Anikiev and Filatiev, they sign autographs. Nelyubov refuses, and also is like, all of this is just, if he apologizes, this literally all goes away.
Nelyubov is the kind of guy that will like throw his gaming controller at like the TV and break both.
By the end of this, he's going to break his career because he cannot be wrong.
Ooh.
Yeah. So, come 2 p.m. the next day, no apology was sent, and so the patrol commander sent a report to Star City's chief of staff on disciplinary violations by the three cosmonauts. Even worse, Nelyubov still did not back down. So, Kamanin confronted him and asked him why the hell he hadn't just apologized. Nelyubov told him the officer could, quote, go to hell.
Okay, the fact the other two get caught up in this, even after, hey, listen, kid, we're sorry.
In light of this, and maybe because he had already hated Nelyubov personally, Kamanin decided to make an example of all three. In like a fucking decimation-like scenario, it would be the other cosmonauts who would decide their fates. According to Alexei Leonov,
it was a short meeting. We all took a vote. All those who believed the three should resign were asked to put up their hands. The decision was unanimous. It was a sad day. In effect, they disrupted their and others' training programs. All of us had agreed on certain rules of behavior, and the penalty for violating them was expulsion from the group. So a vote was taken, and they were expelled.
Woo! This is the collateral destruction we talked about. Nelyubov gets 2 other qualified cosmonauts kicked out of the program. There are 20 cosmonauts in existence at the time. He gets 10% of all cosmonauts, like, got. Because of his stupidity. Because of this drunken brawl and refusing to apologize, 15% of all cosmonauts are kicked out. So the 3 were formally removed from the Cosmonaut Corps on April 17th, 1963. Anikiev and Filatiev, who had been judged guilty by their association with Nelyubov, were kicked out of Star City that same day. Now, for some reason, Nelyubov was allowed to hang around until May, when he was reassigned to an interceptor squadron near Vladivostok, which, if you don't know, is literally at the opposite end of the Soviet Union. And over the next 3 years, he actually got a couple of second chances that he fucked up every time. He was still one of the most qualified cosmonauts in the Soviet Union, and when he went back to being a fighter pilot, he quickly became the best at his squadron. Like, arrogant dick or not, he was still incredibly qualified, and so a lot of cosmonauts fought to get him back in. For example, once in 1963, fellow Vanguard 6 cosmonaut Pavel Popovich flew all the way to Vladivostok and said that if Nelyubov apologized in person to Nikolai Kamanin, he'd probably be let back in, like they were looking for cosmonauts. He flew to Moscow, but apparently botched his apology so bad Kamanin kicked him out. So that's one fuck up. 2 years later, in 1966, he decided to appeal directly to Sergei Korolev, who had always liked him as a trainee. Unfortunately for Nelyubov, within days of sending the letter, Korolev was dead from complications during surgery.
Hey.
To give you an idea, Korolev dies, I believe, on like the 14th of January. Nelyubov sends the letter like a week prior. He's gone. No chance.
He's probably sitting in Korolev's mailbox as he's assuming room temperature.
And like with that, Korolev is dead. Kamanin hates him. There is no chance this guy is ever being a cosmonaut again. I almost said communist. He instantly becomes a capitalist. That's how this ends.
He is spiteful enough.
Yeah, I was gonna say, switching to the other side out of spite sounds like a thing that he would do.
Now, while he was still an incredible pilot and respected in his squadron for his skills, the years after his dismissal were not fun ones for Nelyubov. He started drinking even more heavily and became known for bragging to all the other pilots that he'd once been a cosmonaut, even the backup to Yuri Gagarin, and none of them believed him.
Oh, that irks it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, even whenever he's telling the truth, everyone's just like, yeah, no, he's a fucking dick. According to fellow colleagues, both cosmonaut and pilot, he was mostly written off as a pathetic loner, lying for attention. So it's funny up to this point. I do have to give a content warning for this next part, because this is where things get a little gray. On the 17th of February, 1963, about a month after Korolev's death, Nelyubov returned home from the squadron and had a few drinks before bed. This wasn't uncommon, and his wife Zenaida locked him in his room, fearing for his safety. We don't know exactly when, but Nelyubov woke up, tied a rope out of bed sheets, and climbed down the side of the apartment building. He walked to the Ipolivtoka train station, and a little past midnight, stepped in front of a passing train. He was 31.
Damn.
Yeah.
I think that's something that kind of gets lost in these stories, are the ages of the people involved.
Here I was thinking he was gonna make it to maybe at least 55, 50, yeah. 60, you know, like.
And you see this with Anikiev and Filatiev. A lot of these cosmonauts die young. Either that or they go until they're like 120. There's very little in between with these guys. And especially, so this is 1966. He was selected in 1960. He was 25 when he was selected. Bondarenko, who we talked about, was the youngest person ever picked by a government to fly. He was 23 when he was like drafted into the Cosmonaut Corps. I shouldn't say drafted, selected. Drafting into the Cosmonaut Corps would be the coolest thing, though. It's just like, no, you're going to space. I'm sorry.
This is non-negotiable. It's space time.
So according to cosmonaut Alexei Leonov and the official Soviet version of the story, it was a drunken freak accident. Where they described this kind of thing where like there was a piece of wood that was sticking out on the platform and the train hit it and it sent it spinning in exactly the right way that it struck Nelyubov in the head and killed him. His wife Zenaida, however, knows that it was a suicide because he wrote her a note telling her to carry on and live her life. So ever since 1963, the cosmonaut had fallen further and further into depression. None of the pilots at his new squadron believed his stories. He had no one to turn to, and the death of Korolev in January 1966 effectively ended any hope that Grigory Nelyubov would ever be a cosmonaut again.
It's still so hard to feel sorry for this guy just because it's all self-inflicted.
Oh, absolutely. Not to mention just the fact that like his situation is entirely his fault. And even then, he does not have a bad life after. If he could just accept that, if he could just swallow his pride a little bit, he is the best fighter pilot out of like his entire squadron. He will after a little while, he will be able to pick where he wants to go.
He could have been in charge of the Air Force at some point for all he knows.
But the problem is he got that taste.
He was the top 3 cosmonaut. He was up there with Gagarin and Titov, guys who are like going to be remembered for thousands of years. He downfalls more than anyone else in the Soviet space program. So I can kind of understand not the egotism side, but just, yeah, like having a taste of it, knowing he was that close. Everything else probably feels like anticlimactic and horrible. But even then, like he sabotaged himself every step of the way. Now, like, and this might be poetic justice, this might not. Like Bondarenko, Nelyubov was buried simply as a pilot who had died in a freak accident, with a tombstone made from crashed airplane parts, and those parts were later stolen and sold for scrap.
Oh, that's
like a guy. Like again, he downfalls more than anyone in the Soviet space program. You want to see someone downfall harder? Watch the movie Downfall.
I was going to say that you can't mention the term downfall without me immediately thinking about the movie Downfall.
Grigory Nelyubov is probably the most airbrushed out a man has ever been. Unlike Bondarenko, who was completely unknown and in very few official photographs, Soviet censors had to work hard to remove Nelyubov, Anikiev, and Filatiev from group photos. Like, they had already been in a lot of shots. Nelyubov, in particular, had been one of the 3 candidates for the Vostok 1 flight. There were loads of photos of him, Gagarin, and Titov together in Moscow or at the launch site in Baikonur. So, like that photo we saw there, you can see him, Gagarin, and Titov in Red Square. and they need to get rid of him. And the best example of this, and one of the most famous of these photos, is what space historian James Oberg calls the Sochi 6 photo. So in 1961, after Gagarin's historic flight, all the cosmonauts were sent on a vacation together to a resort in Sochi. There, they took this group photo of the original Vanguard 6 cosmonauts all posing with Korolev. So these are the best of the best. Later on, Soviet books about the first cosmonaut team would show slightly different pictures with Nelyubov edited out. So you can see that in the photo there. Nelyubov, the guy standing tallest in the back, and then gone.
I've got to say, Russian airbrushing is pretty dang good. They Thanos snapped him out of that picture.
And I don't have all of the pictures of it right here. They will be on the YouTube, but James Oberg makes the point that there are actually, and one of the things that tips off Western observers that this is happening is that these photos are edited sequentially a bunch of times. So the first time is just a slapdash get rid of Nelyubov, and then later books would go and refine the photo and change the background a little bit, make it look more realistic and professional. And it does get a lot, like, they do get more professional. They do get better. You wouldn't notice a guy was missing. However, the fact that these photos are being released in state-approved publications, like one year you have one photo, the next year you have a different photo, that tips people off that there is editing going on. So overall, different state-approved publications would run with 3 different edited versions of the photo, using slightly different backgrounds where Nelyubov used to be. And sometimes the censors just fucked up too, because amazingly, the unedited photo actually made it into print as well. Researcher James Oberg was able to put the unedited and edited photos side by side because Soviet books were printed with all 4 versions. When confronted, various Soviet cosmonauts like Leonov and Shonin gave half answers about candidates who had been weeded out of the program for, health reasons or things like that. And it's worth mentioning that while cosmonauts were often required to lie for the sake of Soviet propaganda, and they all knew who Nelyubov was and why he'd been erased, they actually didn't know everything. For one thing, most of them only found out he was dead 20 years later.
It's a little crazy to think about because it's like, just imagine it's like you're in the office and it's just like one of your coworkers is just gone. And it's like, oh yeah, he got sent to another office. He moved. Yeah. And you learn 20 years later that no, they were just dead. They were just dead.
Yeah, that he has been dead for 17 years.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy.
So once the Sochi 6 photo was revealed, people started noticing more and more discrepancies. Nelyubov had been airbrushed out of training photos and photos of cosmonauts in Red Square, all that kind of stuff. Even one of the most famous photos of Yuri Gagarin, him smiling on the bus on the way to the launch pad for Vostok 1, is edited and cropped to remove Nelyubov standing behind him. Now, like most of the erased cosmonauts, Grigory Nelyubov was revealed by the Soviets in 1986 when legendary space journalist Yaroslav Golovanov was allowed to publish a story in Izvestia on the 25th anniversary of Gagarin's death. So this is where we learn about Bondarenko, for example. And I think last time I just kind of called him an official. I have since learned more about Golovanov and his career, and he's someone who has been, even through all the censorship, was fighting hard to figure this stuff out. A lot, he doesn't know this censorship, and then he is being allowed to reveal it. He goes out of his way and he tracks this stuff down himself. And in the Soviet Union, that is a dangerous thing to do. But regardless, among other things, the story laid out why Nelyubov had been erased, and it did not spare readers from learning about how much of a dick he was. Obviously, this doesn't mean he deserved to be removed from history, but Golovanov explained that the erasures had 2 main reasons. So the first is that Nikolai Kamanin, the head of cosmonaut training, was a big believer in cosmonauts being shining examples for all Soviet citizens to look up to. As such, he hated dealing with the fallout of every cosmonaut actually being a drunken man-child. He especially disliked Nelyubov because he was a drunken, arrogant man-child. Once Gagarin became the deputy head of cosmonaut training, this only got worse. When Nelyubov fucked up, Kamanin wanted to make an example of him and the others to teach the more cowboyish cosmonauts a lesson and keep them in line. The second reason is that the Soviets feared that if the stories of Nelyubov got out, it would legitimately shatter the public's view of cosmonauts as role models. There were rumors of cosmonaut parties, but those are different from assaulting Soviet soldiers and acting like a child. Viewed this way, Nelyubov was removed from the cosmonaut corps to protect its image.
After the public started to learn of the insertion.
Yeah. And the thing that kept coming up in my head is I used to referee hockey, and there's this one penalty you can get in hockey called a gross misconduct. It's like, it's pretty severe. It's a 5-minute major, and then you have to go for hearings after. But like a gross misconduct, the definition of it is, if I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it's like any action that makes a travesty of the game of hockey. Nelyubov did that, but for cosmonauts. You know, he made a travesty of the entire institution of being a cosmonaut, at least in the Kremlin's head. In reality, he was, you know, he pushed some lines, but he was about par for the course. Still, though, like, no one deserves to be written out of history, but that I hope that does kind of explain things a little bit, like what the view of the officials and the Kremlin was whenever they did this. It wasn't just for the sake of making a guy disappear. With his status as a cosmonaut finally revealed, there was a push to give Nelyubov's grave in Kremovo a once-over, especially since it was made of crashed plane parts, most of which were already stolen. In the end, the local newspaper was able to raise about $400 worth for a small monument, and the local town museum even added a Hall of Nelyubov, which I want to visit. I want to visit the Hall of the Cosmonaut who never flew and was a disgrace.
They made him a hall, but no statues.
Nelyubov's legacy.
Now, for most stories like this, I'd normally add a big section on what I thought the dude's legacy was, but with this one, I'm not really so sure. Nelyubov was a dick, plain and simple. Someone with incredible skills and drive, the best of the Soviet Union, whose ego somehow managed to go even further than that. He frequently got into arguments with other cosmonauts and always tried to be the center of attention. If anything, I think this actually shows how skilled he was. He managed to claw his way all the way to the top 3 of all cosmonauts when everyone around him hated him. So, like, there's no chance of favoritism. He's not getting any favors from any officials on, like, his selection. He's just that good. And even as a drunk loser ranting in a bar in Vladivostok, he was still an incredible pilot, the best in his entire squadron. He was so good at his job that even after he lost everything and made a mockery of the Cosmonaut Corps, other cosmonauts still tried to get him back.
He still had some friends.
Well, maybe not friends, because a lot of the other cosmonauts did honestly hate his guts. It's just that, like, they could recognize that he is that good at his job. He is that good of a cosmonaut that, like, it's better to put up with him and let him do cosmonaut stuff, even if he is a moron. Man, now that I hadn't really thought of it before, but imagine if he had flown, like, his ego would have just turned into a singularity.
Potentially.
Oh, like, it just ego implosion.
Oh no, he would have sucked at least 2 more astronauts into his spiral because that spiral was coming.
He would have murdered Yuri Gagarin for being first.
Good God.
And in my opinion, you have to look at it 2 ways. So this story is only interesting because the Soviets tried to erase Nelyubov from history. If they hadn't, this would be the story of an arrogant asshole failing, which is always good. Nelyubov getting kicked out of the Cosmonaut Corps was his fault. His actions got 2 other cosmonauts fired just by association. The remaining cosmonauts, even the ones who could tolerate him like Popovich, never forgave him for that. When asked about him, Popovich said this.
I was probably the first one to hear about his death, but I decided not to fly down to his funeral. And even if all the cosmonauts had known about his death, nobody would have gone. Usually we do not forgive the betrayal, and he betrayed us.
Which is like a really interesting, like an understandable way to look at it. Like this guy, through his idiocy, got 15% of the cosmonaut corps of the Soviet Union gone. When looked at that way, like the amount of investment that goes into a pilot, a fighter pilot, an astronaut, a cosmonaut, like years and years, millions, billions of dollars of training and hardware and all of this infrastructure to get them to where they are. And then this dipshit, this fucking drunken man-child punches a conscript and doesn't apologize. And then that's that.
And something else to consider is they put it to a vote. As a group, they decided that those 2 other guys were worth kicking him out over.
And all he had to do was genuinely say that he was sorry. With the mass of the Soviet machine pointing a gun at his head, telling him, say sorry. And he doesn't do that.
Like, think about that. The Soviet machine gave him an out. That is borderline outside context.
But on the other hand, no one deserves to be erased from history. And the Soviet attempts to airbrush Nelyubov and the other cosmonauts out, they spawned decades of lies and conspiracy theories that still like haunt the entire space industry and historians to this day. Like, fuck.
Yeah.
Chris's, that was the story of Grigory Nelyubov, the man whose name means unloved. Did I not say that earlier? His name means unloved.
Oh, wait.
Did I leave that out?
You left
God
that
damn it.
out.
I'll splice that in earlier.
No. I like it learning that at the end.
I love how so often it is that we talk about Soviet media editing, and then you go and do your own media editing.
And then I, without a hint of irony, say, oh, I'll change that up to make it look and sound better. If I were a better man, I'd probably learn something from that. But I'm not. I am the Grigory. Yeah, like, fucking out of Nelyubov. Fuck, how have I already forgotten his name? Nelyubov. Fuck. Nelyubov. There we go. As soon as I get like the metric, the beat of it out of my head, it just fucking breaks. Out of Anikiev, Nelyubov, and Filatiev, who is us? What's everybody in this
Nobody
lineup?
wants to pick Nelyubov, so we're not going to.
Fine. Out of the two Chris's, who's Ivan Anikiev and who's Valentin Filatiev?
Yeah. This
All right.
year.
You get to be Valentin Filatiev, Chris.
Fantastic.
And I guess I get to be Grigory Nelyubov. Fuck that guy. I can think he has a tragic end, but just like, fuck that guy.
Wait a second. With that context, hold up. Does that mean that we're going to get voted out of the Bethaverse?
We're not in the... They have guested.
The adjacent.
We're like
Then?
Proxima.
Yes.
That's about it.
We're like... If the Bethaverse is a solar system, we're like the fucking bullshit planetoids.
Sedna.
We're like Ceres and all that stuff that hardly
you
counts.
say that like Ceres is bad. Ceres rules, man.
No, I know. We're just not officialed, and we're like tangentially involved. Although I wonder if we're more a moon of LLBD.
The implication that a planetoid is any less valuable than a planet. It's special in its own way.
This does stroke my Nelyubov ego. Yes.
Uh-oh. It's starting.
Oh,
It's taking hold.
Thank you for reinforcing everything I already believe.
The Nelyubov pathogen spreads.
But yeah, no, audience, I very much apologize. It might have been for a good joke, but it probably wouldn't have added much to the story. Nelyubov does translate roughly in Russian to unloved. And yeah, who was the guy who was written out of history for being a dick. How are we all feeling?
I would say much better than last time, for sure.
Nice.
He didn't deserve to get erased out of history, but he deserved all of the things that happened.
Yes. Everything up to that point. Like, he probably shouldn't have been a fighter pilot at that point. He should have been in trouble with the law. He assaulted a guy.
His consolation prize
no...
was an immaculate career still. Something amazing.
Being one of the best pilots in the Soviet Union. And even then, like, whenever he becomes a pilot, all of the pilots also hate him because he's an arrogant dick. And I know we talked about it before. I hope his NKVD dad erased the part of his mind that remembered his son.
I only have a nephew.
Oh my God. We need to just make like the Soviet cosmonaut family tree, except there's a bunch of like branches just missing. And like entire rows that are gone, like Yuri Gagarin being born of a immaculate conception because his dad doesn't exist anymore. We could get there. Like the fucking cult of Yuri Gagarin could legitimately get him to Jesus levels. But yeah, audience, thank you so much for listening. We will have more. We might not be doing Forgotten Cosmonaut stuff sequentially next time, for sure this time. And I know I've said this in like 5 episodes repeatedly. We will be talking about Sea Dragon. Finally, hopefully. Asterisk. If you are interested in supporting the show further and getting access to a fun bonus episode as well as monthly bonus episodes going forward, please check out our new Patreon linked in the description below. We would very much appreciate it. And until next time, don't be a dick. Don't get your friends erased from history.
Thank you for listening to Failure to Launch. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or tell a friend. Everything helps. If you want to follow us, contact us, or suggest a topic, you can email us at launchfailurepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter at launch_failure. Failure to Launch is hosted on Anchor, and we post on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We also post our episodes with visual aids on YouTube at Failure to Launch. All music was provided by DJ Danarchy.